Okay, Miriam, you can start. As soon as you don't see me anymore, you can start. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege to introduce you to our distinguished guest, Kevin Young, the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and poetry editor at The New Yorker. Kevin is widely regarded as one of the leading poets of his generation, formerly the curator of the Raymond Danowski Poetry Library at Emory University. His 11 books of poetry include Brown, Blue Laws, selected and uncollected poems, longlisted for the National Book Award, Book of Hours, a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and winner of the Lenore Marshall Prize for Poetry from the Academy of American Poets, and Ardency, a chronicle of the Amistad Rebels, winner of an American Book Award. He has also edited the anthologies Blues Poems, Jazz Poems, and for Library of America, John Berryman Selected Poems. Kevin is here today to share and talk about his work on the landmark anthology African American Poetry 250 Years of Struggle and Song, which will be published by Library of America in September. Kevin, welcome to Library Marketing Buzz, and thank you for joining us. We would love to hear a little bit more about the process of putting together this anthology.
Thanks for having me. Putting together the anthology was a privilege. It was a long process, but it was also really rewarding. I got to discover poets that I hope your listeners and readers and viewers can discover too. And I think there is a quality of discovery in an anthology like this. There's nearly 250 poets for each of the 250 years that are represented, and it goes from 1770 and Phillis Wheatley to the present day. And that was one of the things I right away knew as I wanted to start with Wheatley, who's such a foundational figure and someone who wrote under extreme duress. She was enslaved in Boston, but she was also witness to the changes that built our nation. The American Revolution was raging in Boston around her. And I think that irony between her enslavement and her having to go to England, she physically went to England to meet with her patron to get her book published, and then having us, separating from England is a real poignant moment. And I think her writing is quite brave and powerful in that way. I'm really struck doing the book at sort of the ways that she engages a lot of the themes that emerge in the book, themes of history, themes of protest, in her case, not necessarily explicitly, but there's a lot of goddesses and gods referred to in the Greek who were very rebellious. There's also, like the subtitle says, a lot of struggle and song, both in her work and throughout. One of the things people, I think, tend to overlook about Wheatley is that she was not alone as a Black writer, though she's often represented that way in the tradition. She had connections to other Black people, Obor Tanner, a friend of hers. She has a poem to Scipio Moorhead, who's a Black artist. She says an African to SM, an African painter, on seeing his works. And we think that's the person who painted who created the famous frontispiece, or the engraving that was based on a Moorhead image. And so there's a sense of community too in Wheatley, but also I hope in the entire book. There are people writing back to each other. There's people writing against each other. There's a real centuries-long conversation that's occurring between the pages of the book. And I think beyond, it really is the hardest thing I think about doing the book was really cutting it down. It could have been twice as big, even though it's a big book already. And another early decision besides starting with Wheatley was where to end. And we really want to end as currently as possible. I wish I could have put all of the people that are in the kind of exciting Renaissance. There's far more poets writing now than ever, and I think that's an exciting thing. An anthology like this, we can't put all those people in there, but we can give a sense of the richness of that tradition. And what I was struck by was that, my generation, which used to be the youngest generation, is perhaps not anymore. There are younger writers than us, which is very exciting. And that's where you see this real blooming. But also you see the way that they're connected to this long tradition. And I see a lot of poems of protest, of anticipating the moment we're in when we're having, I think, the widest and biggest protests in American history. And I think a lot of that is foreshadowed in this poetry.
What other themes thread through the anthology, and could you speak to how the book is organized?
The book is organized really chronologically in generations. These are, inexact, but I really wanted to convey the sense of changes in history and chunks of time. The first section is chronological, moving from Wheatley to the present, mostly by publication, when people first started publishing and working. And because people were often writing, as I say in that section, to freedom, they're writing in freedom, they're writing about freedom, even though they're enslaved, they're writing their way out of freedom, like George Moses Horton attempted to. And I think that theme really runs through the whole book of freedom. But then the rest of the book is really in chronological chunks. The Harlem Renaissance section, which is called The Dark Tower, is really, I think, a rich one that shows the breadth of people like Langston Hughes and, Countee Cullen. But I was really focused on a lot of the women writers throughout history. And I really strove hard to try to get a kind of gender parity in the book and really explore all genders and see the ways that people have been writing all along. And, the Harlem Renaissance is really a great site of that. But, there's a lot of, I got really into and geeked out on the kind of little things, like, should we put this poet in this section, even though some of their poems were 30 years before, but that's when they got famous. Things like that, which I think speak more to the challenges of putting together an anthology, but B, an anthology of Black poetry, which is really engaged with the fact that a lot of these poets weren't able to produce a book. A lot of the women poets, especially during the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, very few produced a book, though they wrote wonderful poems and certainly book-length manuscripts, and sometimes they couldn't get them published. And so I really there's an act of recovery in the anthology as much as it's of representation. And I think that's a really important theme. And I think the writers themselves write about that. They think about what it means that this person was forgotten, or they insist on remembering. And this insistence on remembering, I think, is a large part of African-American culture and memory and cultural history.
And would you be able to speak about your research and selection then a little bit more? What were
How long
some
do we
of the
have?
biggest
I mean, do we have 2 hours?
challenges?
Because I could certainly talk for 2 hours about the research. I tend to try to go back to the sources. There's a rich history of African-American anthologies. And in the introduction, I talk a lot about things like James Weldon Johnson's 1922 anthology and a lot of the importance of that early anthology and cultural work. But I really was trying to go and get some of the poems from the books themselves, but sometimes even the magazines. But there's a lot of great writing, especially recovery around that, and some of that's represented and I talk about in the introduction. But there was also a quality of just requesting books. Luckily, I was started the anthology when I was at Emory University, which has a really rich poetry library, and then I came to the Schomburg Center as its director, which has, of course, the best Black collection in the world. And to me, that was really symbolic of the poles of what the research required. So sometimes it was looking at manuscripts, but quite frankly, one of the richest resources is a resource we made in the Schomburg, I should say, in the 1990s, very early digital humanities project on 19th century women writers. And that large-scale project, which is online, and the website's now been archived because it's so old, but it's so useful. And I was using it all the time to see the full range, because I think people will be surprised to see the rich 19th century holdings that are represented in the anthology itself. we kind of, even if we know of Wheatley, we kind of just fast forward to Paul Laurence Dunbar sometimes, and you really can see the rich writing, not always in English. Some Les Sanels, a group of Creole poets writing, published the first anthology in the 19th century of African American poetry. And so there's a lot of things that were fun to track down, sometimes hard to track down, but that's part of the point. And I hope that the anthology only sends people on their own journeys back into doing that research. I think scouring the current landscape was also part of it. And luckily, being a poetry editor at the New Yorker, the poetry editor, I see a lot of poetry, and I feel like I was able to kind of at least see the landscape, though I couldn't represent every figure there.
Did you review, identify songs and poems in different other formats other than in print as well, like audio?
If only I could have done songs. I mean, there's luckily a number of anthologies of songs. Even when I did the Blues Poems anthology, which was the first anthology of just blues, I could only include a few songs there. But that is the reality of publishing. Both there's such a rich tradition of poets, and though they refer to song, I'm using song metaphorically. There are a couple songwriters who also were poets, Gil Scott-Heron being probably foremost among them, but he also published books and was interested on the page. And he stands in for a whole host of other writers because, of course, there's the rich oral tradition of African-American poetry, but also African-American culture. So couldn't represent all of that. And I think many an anthology struggles with that question, but I think we came down on the right side of talking about it and not being able to showcase all of it, but thinking about it out loud and helping you realize as a reader and a listener that there's this rich oral part of this. I mean, I would love to see some of the oral qualities of that be represented. We just couldn't do that in print. Another tradition that became really clear to me that is deserving of further notice is something like the Black children's verse, which is really extensive, precedes Langston Hughes, but Langston Hughes wrote it. There's many other writers, and especially now you see really powerful verse aimed at younger readers. And it's one of those things we just couldn't include that, but it's a whole other thing that I think is really exciting to think about. And a lot of the poets who are in the anthology also did write for children and younger people.
Mm. Could you speak a little bit about the Current Renaissance and the Darkroom Collective?
Sure, yeah, I was in a group called the Darkroom Collective. We were based in Boston and were founded at the funeral of James Baldwin. And after that time, there was a pilgrimage down of some of the soon-to-be founders, and they declared, "Hey, we don't want another figure to die without us having met them," and founded this collective. And we went from hosting events, which I wasn't yet part of the group, but I did go to some of those events in the house they had in Cambridge, Mass. And then to writing our own work, and around then is when I joined, and we would tour around and gig around. And I think that some part of that, helped with the Renaissance. I'm not the person to say that, but others have said that. And I certainly think that we were really interested in connecting these generations, older generation. One of the keys of the reading series was having established writers read with emerging writers, who of course now are the established writers. I mean, I'm really happy that we gave the first Darkroom Poetry Prize to Yusef Komunyakaa, who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize and is just one of the greats, and Stop. And so I think that, there was this connection. And I think continuity is really important. You see it in this current moment where I think a lot of the poets come out of collectives they themselves made. They might have come from Cave Canem. They might have come from somewhere very far away, Cave Canem being the most important, I think, of the workshops. But there's many other spaces that people have created And I know just from having been part of that and other spaces that, if you need a space, you sometimes have to make it. And I hope that the anthology gestures towards some of those spaces and some of those other collectives, like the Black Took Collective, which is a great group of writers, and the Black Boys Collective. I mean, we could go on, but who are really doing interesting work in breaking down barriers and seeing the whole of poetry.
Would you be willing to read a poem from the collection?
Sure, yes. I was thinking of reading a poem by a poet you may not have heard of, but who I think is worth very much a big look. And give me 1 second here while I pull him up.
Thank you.
So this is a poet named Fenton Johnson. Fenton Johnson was a Chicago poet, and he wrote in many different forms. He wrote in spirituals, which we include in the anthology, and he wrote also in early prose poems. There's a little bit of debate, which is exciting, whether these are long lines or prose poems themselves. Either way, they're very experimental and free verse. Mind you, these are in the 19 teens. So over 100 years ago, he was writing. And one of my favorite poems of his is probably his most famous, called Tired. And in it, he's thinking a lot about, I think a different kind of protest, a protest about existence and, as he said, civilization. And I think by civilization, he means society and its woes. And he is explicitly is writing about race and resistance. The other thing I would say about the poem is it's situated in the other prose poems. I really wanted to include all of them. He had a fire later on, and so these are the poems we have of his from this later period, but I want to preserve all of them in one place. This is called Tired. I'm tired of work. I'm tired of building up somebody else's civilization. Let us take a rest, Melissa Jane. I will go down to the Last Chance Saloon, drink a gallon or two of gin, shoot a game or two of dice, and sleep the rest of the night on one of Mike's barrels. You will let the old shanty go to rot, the white people's clothes turn to dust, and the Calvary Baptist Church sink to the bottomless pit. You will spend your days forgetting you married me, and your nights hunting the warm gin Mike serves the ladies in the rear of the Last Chance Saloon. Throw the children into the river. Civilization has given us too many. It is better to die than it is to grow up and find out that you are colored. Pluck the stars out of the heavens. The stars mark our destiny. The stars marked my destiny. I'm tired of civilization.
Thank you so much for sharing this poem. And thank you for gathering together this magnificent chorus of voices.
Well, it was a real pleasure and honor, and I think I'm always struck by, seeing it all together. You experience such a different thing than when you're looking at these little pieces of what becomes a bigger thing. But I think that's like the tradition itself. The tradition, there's such tremendous poets. I could have put, and I think I once tried to, 50, 60 pages of Langston Hughes or Gwendolyn Brooks and, Lucille Clifton. It would barely be enough. At the same time, I was struck by how the whole and the parts really add up to more and tell us something about where we are now. It speaks with prophecy, with precision, and with a power that I think we really have to listen to. And so I hope people get a chance to enjoy that.
Thank you so much. The African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle Song will be published in September by Library of America. Thank you so much, Kevin Young.
Thanks a lot.